After the end of the Assad family's 5-decade rule in Syria, many are looking ahead with both optimism and uncertainty. Throughout it all, young people have continued to document their daily life on social media. The ABC has spoken to some Syrians about the turmoil of the last few weeks as they share their hopes and fears about the new regime. Reporter Chantal Al-Khoury has more.
I think the general consensus has been that this is a dangerous and uncertain time for the Syrian people. There's an acknowledgement that this is also going to be a crucial few months for what direction the country is going to go in. And there's been a mix of reactions. Obviously, we've seen footage of celebrations over the end of the regime, the release of political prisoners, and also the potential return of refugees. We know millions of people were made refugees during the war, but also there is this certain cautious optimism that you're hearing from some people and fear about what the future will look like. You only have to look at what happened in Libya after the fall of Gaddafi to understand why those fears are there. And also, a distrust in the new leadership. I've been hearing a lot of that from people on the ground, the uncertainty around seeing Israeli airstrikes across the country, and also these fears around a resurgence of extremism.
Now, you spoke to a young woman who's been documenting her life on TikTok. What did she share with you?
Yeah, she is someone that really stood out. She's a 21-year-old woman. Her name is Naya Ali, and she's from Damascus. She's a young artist, so she's a painter and a poet, and a lot of her work revolves around what it's like to grow up in a war zone. And, she would have been 8 when the war began. And you'll see her TikToks right now. She's documenting her daily life, filming herself getting ready to leave the house and talking about being kept up by Israeli airstrikes, by the sound of Israeli airstrikes, and, not being able to wash her hair because of water cuts, which have been a reality for the Syrian people for far too long. And also, as you've just seen, the reaction to airstrikes near her home, and, she uses a lot of humour in her videos, talking about, she'd captioned it, Damascus is getting bombed right now and we all might die, but my dad won't let these plants die that easily. So she was, really good-humoured and kind of said to me that Syrians are in this constant state of happiness and fear about what their future will look like. She tries to make her content happy, as she described it, even though people might not see it that way. And another priority for her was making sure that people saw the beauty of her country. And, she said, when people hear Syria, they think of war, and that's something that she wanted to change. So she really is part of this young generation of Syrians who are reimagining what their future could look like.
Now, what's been the response so far to the country's new leadership? Yeah,
it's been interesting because there's been a mixed response. We know that there were rallies in Damascus calling for the protection of Syrian women's rights, around democracy, a secular government for what is a very diverse country. We're also hearing from minority groups who fear persecution, who have a lot of distrust when it comes to this new leadership and their extremist past. I spoke to a Christian school teacher from Naya. He says this transitional government has to cooperate with the Syrian people to ensure that everyone is coexisting, all Syrian sects, and also that while the rhetoric from this government has been sound, as he described it, he hasn't been reassured. He's seeing faces he doesn't know how they'll treat minority groups as a Christian himself. And Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they're considered a terrorist organisation by the United Nations. They'd cut ties with ISIS and al-Qaeda in recent years. And we're hearing from the leader where he's promising this inclusive and stable government, and talking to people on the ground. They're talking about, how do you essentially rebrand an extremist past? And they're questioning whether it's part of a strategy to garner support. We have, the Human Rights Watch talking about these groups imposing strict laws on women in the past, limiting their freedom and access to work and education, human rights violations, including the abduction of women. So there is a lot of fear around what could happen with this group if their words are true, that they will bring a more harmonious and equal future for all. I also did speak to people who felt reassured by the promises made by this group, which was interesting. A Damascus jeweller said, he feels reassured, he feels positive about what he's heard, but essentially it's a waiting game. And that's kind of what I heard across the board. They might feel positive now, but it's a waiting game to see what happens.
And what did they have to say about the role the Israeli government has been playing in the regime change?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that's caused a lot of uneasiness. Obviously, they've been watching the past 14 months of what's happening in Gaza. We know the UN Secretary General has condemned what's been more than 400 airstrikes in Syria, and they've also demanded that Israeli forces withdraw from Syrian territory after it seized a significant stretch of land between the occupied Golan Heights and Syria. The Golan Heights was occupied by Israel and has been occupied by Israel since 1967, annexed in 1981. The US and Israel are the only countries that see it as Israeli territory. So seeing the events of the past week, Syrians that I've spoken to are saying this is a country that is taking advantage of the current circumstances in Syria for a land grab. And, we would have heard earlier that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is wanted by the ICC for alleged war crimes, he's approved more settlements in the region. And it kind of plays into that fear for many Syrian people that international players are taking advantage of this fragmented territory right now. Naya Ali, that woman that I spoke to before, said it's just creating more fear for the people in the community.
And there are renewed calls for sanctions to be reviewed. What do we know?
Yeah, so Syrians have been calling for Western sanctions to be lifted for 14 years now. We know that, 16.7 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, according to the UN. UN experts and Syrian economists say that these sanctions have worsened the economic crisis in Syria. It's disproportionately affected Syrian civilians. Their access to things like medication is something they'll bring up often. And, you'll hear from humanitarian workers who say that these sanctions have hindered aid efforts. They've made Syrians more dependent on emergency humanitarian assistance. So these calls have been going on for years now. Those calls have been renewed now that there's a change of leadership. And that school teacher that I mentioned said people have been living without these basic the minimum necessities, essentially, and said, the people have suffered a lot from difficult living conditions because of the sanctions imposed on us, not as officials and leaders, and they're hoping to see that change. So it'll be interesting to see what countries look at lifting those sanctions. Obviously, those conversations are still happening.